of us there.
Yeah, we're good to go.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, well, I guess I'll just say thank you for the invitation, and as I said earlier, I'll repeat it here officially. For those coming in from the outside, there's not going to be a lot of engagement, I'm afraid, with Mark in this particular talk, but I hope that by the time we get to the conference, I will have a chance to update my thinking on his new work and maybe engage with him. There is going to be a lot of engagement with Ruth Milliken, however, and I'm grateful that she's here because she's been truly an inspiration to my thinking and still is, really since I was a PhD student all the way till now. So I still find her material fresh and I have to constantly deal with it. So she's hovering over the waters of this presentation, as you'll see. So of course, that doesn't mean I agree with everything that Ruth thinks. So my favorite line to my students is, I love Ruth, but I love truth more. So my line on this is that I think that there are things where we will come to have a robust disagreement, but I think there's subtle disagreements. So it'd be interesting to work some of those out and get clear about them. In any case, I'm going to start by just very briefly putting out some basic clarifications about these debates about whether it's possible and why we might think we need to do without content and basic cognition and what the implications will be. So we'll start with some clarifications. The core of the presentation will be about my motivations, and then if those motivations are sufficient, what would be the implications for our thinking? And they'll be relatively brief, so that the real guts is the middle part of the paper. So to move on with the clarifications, I think if I were to state this, hold on a second, I need to just move these faces out of the way so that I can see what I'm actually writing on the screen here. Let me do that. I'd say that one of the core ideas of what I call radically inactive embodied cognition is that cognition is not uniform. It doesn't always and everywhere involve or entail representational content. And that's the thesis that I'm going to try to push today. That doesn't mean that there couldn't be, and to anticipate a comment that might come up, that we might find something more generalized that could encompass all forms. But I'm thinking, and you'll see why I've targeted representational content, and I'll show you in a moment if we stipulate it in a certain canonical way. So there's a couple of moves in here that we might want to come back to argumentatively, already packed into this. But this, I think, was a thesis that I put forward and defended for some time, which I would say has touched a nerve, precisely because this is a standard way that people have argued and thought. And so what is challenged here, at the very least, hits quite a few ways of conceiving of content. Okay, let's just see if I can push that along. So the idea here then is that the root form of cognition is extensively relational, and here's the sock to Mark, interactive. That's its core feature, if anything, and that will be the core feature of all cognition. But content involving is not a signature feature of every type of cognition. One thing I should get clear of from the beginning is I'm not actually, and never have been, a anti-representationalist or a non-representationalist. So I do believe there is such a thing as content. I just don't think it's at the roots of cognition. So the radicalness of this thesis is tempered by that thought. Well, the real thesis that was in the papers that you would have been sent, particularly the paper Much Ado About Nothing, is really whether there's any point in having this discussion at all. If we go back and ask the question, should the cognitive sciences commit to representational theory of mind, go back as far back as 1979, of course, Paul Churchland was making claims like this, rather grandiose, but still captures the core of the debate as it stood. Only by purging intentional notions from mature scientific psychology will we be properly at home in the physical universe for the very first time. 1979, his slim book on science and the plasticity of mind. Fodor, of course, famously tells us in 1987, the loss of intentional psychology, quote, would be beyond comparison the greatest intellectual catastrophe in the history of our species. Never one to miss a chance for hyperbole, but here we have it. And so that's the kind of stuff that I entered into academia with when I was doing my PhD. This was very much in the air. I think what's interesting is 30 years on, we still find people as firmly divided, though they typically take it, can hear a slightly more empirically oriented claim, a point to the claims now. But look at, we have, as the example for the eliminativists, we have Rosenberg, who tells us neuroscientists have given us every reason to suppose that what really happens in the brain is nothing even remotely like what representational theory of mind claims is going on. In fact, if you've read the 2018 book by Rosenberg, he goes so far as to tell us that behaviorism won hands down, right? So it's very, very strong. And of course, in the other corner, we have Nick Shea telling us there is very good reason to believe that thinking is the processing of meaningful physical entities, mental representations. That insight is one of the most important discoveries of the 20th century. So apparently, you know, this debate hasn't faded in terms of prominent individuals taking opposite sides very, very strongly, any more than any other philosophical debate. But here's the rub. What about, is this just the usual thing? Philosophers keep going on about problems that are intractable and insolvable and really don't make much contact with the sciences of the mind. There's been an argument afoot for a while in different formats, but I'll just focus again on one particular spokesperson. There's no point attempting to settle the RTM question. It's all just semantics. The debate has no practical or theoretical value. Mark Rowlands told us this. He thinks that the RTM question only inspires, quote, a series of more or less loosely connected debates, scarred by ambiguities, misunderstandings, equivocations, and proponents talking past opponents. Different philosophers and scientists employ different, more or less stringent criteria of what counts as a mental representation. And as he puts it, quote, any profile will, in its own way, be controversial. Thinking that any such profile can license the claim that R is a representation or that it is not will require that one be willing to reject theories of representation that others adopt, and in their eyes have good arguments in support of this adoption. Okay. If that's right, or maybe this is where we wind up, the upshot may well be that we cannot ask the RTM question simpliciter, because the sciences of mind do not operate with a singular, unequivocal proprietary notion of mental representation. And just as a kind of Shakespearean aside, this is where I think we can, at the end of the paper I'm going to present, we might want to come back and discuss the opening lines I had in light of Ruth's 2020 paper, with respect to whether we can find a kind of some common, if we generalize enough, whether we could just find some common way of understanding this that has the appropriate properties. I think that might be possible, but I don't think that the property, again, will be semantic content in anything like the standard variety. So that's going to be my strong claim that I'm going to try to defend here. When I first came to this question, tried to develop a hard target, and I came to it in a slightly different way. I tried to look at what was it that was most typically or canonically assumed, even if we had to stipulate somewhat contra Rowlands, to say, look, I don't want to legislate the use of the term representation, but if we look at the most canonical uses, and one of the most important ones, you can see what sense the claim that basic cognition lacks content, what that would mean and what that's challenging. So what would be the hard target if that's the case? I looked actually about 15 textbooks of foundations of cognitive science, and typically you get something, this quote from Travis doesn't really take us too far away from something like the standard definition that pops up a lot, and I'll show you in a couple of voices. Representational content has correctness conditions of a special sort, not just any old correctness conditions, not just anything that has the property of possibility of malfunction or normativity conditions, but rather those that are entailed by, quote, taking things, quote, as being thus and so, where for all that things need not be that way being that which specifies the way things would have to be. What we have then is to use, when Ruscola kind of uses this in his attempt to deal with something like the Roland's problem, when he's discussing it, he points it this way. Philosophers and scientists use the phrase mental representation in many different ways. The type of mental representation, and then he stipulates here, that concerns me, and I would argue that typically concerns philosophers when they're talking about this issue, involves representational content, such that a mental state has a content that represents the world as being a certain way. We can ask whether the world is indeed that way. These states are semantically valuable with respect to such properties as, and now you can vary which of these correct types of correctness conditions you want, whether it's truth, accuracy, or fulfillment, but they're fulfilling the clause of saying how things are specified as being on the one hand of the ledger, and then how things are, very much the correspondence theory of truth model, disquotational model. So we get some specification, and then we can see whether or not that's been fulfilled or whether it has or hasn't. Okay, so that's the common, I think, notion that people are typically operating, which doesn't mean that someone might not use the attempt to use a notion of mental representation in the sciences of the mind that's more deflationary or doesn't actually track these issues. Here's Karen Neander, again, great philosopher who's gone missing. Something only counts as mental representation if it is, quote, used to represent a target as being a certain way that it might or might not be. If a mental state represents at all, it represents something in one way and not in innumerable other possible ways. So this recurring notion of a certain way of how things are represented. And Karen, of course, emphasizes and underlines the fact that this property, of course, is to emphasize the notion of content as intentional with an S by saying, quote, a red flag would be raised if the relevant content descriptions were not intentional with an S. And of course, that's a common move that Fodor explicitly makes, telling us, quote, the mark of the mental is its intentionality with an S. That's to say mental states have content. And just to stress, because sometimes in this literature, people, when I raise these points, will say, well, that's Fodor's language of thought had a lot of special features. And if you're criticizing Fodor, he doesn't speak for all representationalists. What I'm trying to get at, and I just want to stress this before we move on, is that what I'm talking about here, I think, is a very common property of anyone, whatever vehicles you think are the basis for representation, or indeed, if you want to have a broader, what I'll call, notion of representational correctness conditions. So here, you know, is Cummings, but you can think of cognitive maps if you like. So we can be quite general about this property, but I think that people are pretty much agreed that if a representation doesn't have the property of having these representational correctness conditions, then it's not really anything that we would want to call, we would find interesting philosophically as a representationalism. Pache, deflationists, there's a whole maneuver. Here I'm thinking of a couple of people such as Bill Ramsey and Francis Egan, who've tried to lower the heat on what exactly is required there. But I'm putting that aside for a moment. That would take a longer discussion. But you can think of cognitive maps, he said, Cummins says, as mental representations. Though they represent the world as being a certain way, they do not as a class represent it in the same sort of way that sentences or beliefs represent it. So on that model, there's something about the very idea that the content is still intentional with an S in some respect, but it doesn't have the same kind of vehicular properties. Accordingly, for many theorists, mental representations, quote, do not have propositional contents as well. So we could also vary the propositionality of this. They are not candidates for truth conditional semantics. Now, if you plug in something like accuracy conditions or verticality conditions or fulfillment conditions, or however you want to understand that, I'm arguing that we can still generalize and think that the notion that people are clinging on to here as is that representations must have intentional with an S content of some kind. I think that's fairly canonical, and I think that's a reasonable hard target for what the field assumes when we talk about this. Okay, so that's the backdrop clarification, if you like, about what it is that I'm talking about when I'm talking about content, or suggesting that there can be forms of cognition that don't have content of that kind. Okay, so motivations. Well, I've called this in my own work, I've been motivated by largely with the works of authors such as Fodor, Millikan, Dretske, and others, to be perturbed by certain attempts to naturalize content. And of course, I have argued that the problem about naturalizing it turns out to be as difficult and problematic, the notion of content I just described, as with some other caveats, as the hard problem of consciousness. So I've coined the idea that we have a hard problem of content in respect of what we just talked about. That is, as well, that should concern us as much as the hard problem of consciousness, though I don't think it's intractable or impossible. If you notice the second paper I wrote, there's a lot more to say about why I think there are differences between the nature of the problem we face here and that of Chalmers. I don't think it's metaphysically impossible to deal with, but I think it can't be dealt with using certain types of resources. I like Nick Shea's way of putting this. This is British understatement for you. He thinks we have a little problem in the foundations of cognitive science. And it's going to be important for what comes later that he actually characterizes it in different ways in different places. He speaks here, he says, quote, "We don't yet have a clear idea of how representations could get meanings, where the meaning does not derive from the understanding of an external interpreter." So meanings is one bit of language. And then he also puts it this way: how do mental states manage to be about things in the external world? How do they get their aboutness? The physical and biological sciences offer no model of how naturalistically respectable properties could be like that, could have this property being about something else. So he's taking meaning and aboutness to be pretty much equivalent here, and I will want to try to separate that a little as we go along. And we can see it again when he makes the comment, he brings the two notions together around the notion of content. He asks the question, what determines the content of a mental representation? That's the content question, as he puts it. Surprisingly, there's no agreed answer. Now, when we come to this, and here I'm channeling Ruth's paper from 2020, I liked her way of separating out the question of what determines content, how you might fill that out from a commitment to teleosemantics in some broader sense, which is much simpler, as she puts it. And I do think that, and here I think Rosenberg, when he was making these claims, taps into that thought about what our options are. If we're naturalists and if we're thinking in terms of the basis of explaining the kind of standards and norms that we need to account for, he thinks naturalism is best resource, and as he puts it, perhaps its only resource for solving that basic problem of intentionality certainly seems to be Darwin's theory of natural selection. So he's answering in one fell swoop both what determines content and also buying into something like the idea that only something that gives us those kind of norms will come from biology. And he thinks that's what makes teleosemantics inevitable. And as Ruth's work had shown us, some of us have tried to argue, she puts it, that we should ground the needed norms in evolutionary biology. And I think that's, if we have to account for the norms that exist when we think of the possibility of misrepresentation, our options here are limited. So I've signed up to that long ago. I think that the chances of getting this to work by some other mechanistic account, I think the analysis that Ruth typically gives convinced me long ago that that's fairly forlorn. So I'm not even going to rehearse any of that, but there might be people in the audience who might want to push back on that. But that's at least where I'm starting. The question then gets into whether it could also, we could look to something in particular like natural selection to get us going with the most basic forms of content. So that's where I've been focusing on for some time. And I think this is the rub. I don't think we can get out of natural selection anything like a basic notion of content in the robust intentional with an S sense that I was speaking about earlier. Okay, and now this is rehearsing again some long-standing issues that people will be very familiar with. So we know the indeterminacy problem. If we stick to something simple like the case of the frog, but I think it can extrapolate to any other system that we're talking about, at least any primitive system that comes out of biology. In the case of the frog's visual motion detector, fly or moving black dot could be both simultaneously acceptable descriptions of the signal's semantic content. It seems that no amount of environmental appropriateness or neural state or its effects is fine-grained enough to give us unique, here originally this passage said propositional content, but I've removed that so that we can just focus on the idea of content, because it doesn't really matter if you want to, I think if you want to swap in some variant of non-propositional content that has the features that I described. In other words, we're not going to get a unique intentional with an S content that we can assign to the neural state. There's been lots of attempts over time to address this. The more serious ones have tried to target, figure out what the supposed target would be by means of some form of counterfactual analysis. And that ambition was to reveal which items were causally efficacious in the survival and proliferation of the system. Philosophers and biologists tried this pretty hard for a time, which of these would have been selected for as opposed to having been merely selected. And the results were not good. We wound up with, you know, an emphasis, say, on the food, not the black dot feature, not the flies feature, or the flies, not them being black dots, not the food, or black dots, not flies, not food. We try to isolate these from the other things that are also instantiated in the same moment. That analysis seems really hard because, of course, any one of those descriptions about what the target would be seem adequate in the situation, and they all come together anyway. So trying to parse those out by means of counterfactual analysis seems not to be very helpful. Goods and Griffiths 1995 concluded from this that those levels are best understood as complementary, not competing, and I think that's right. Accordingly, if we want to ascribe, they concluded, any content to the frog's state of mind, it would be an inclusive list, a conjunction, not a disjunction problem. We'd say something like, of all the following, the things that come with that object: small, dark and moving, nutritious, fitness enhancing, fly. So a whole long list of properties of the things that attach to things like flies. If we were to discuss this further, I think that Ruth's answer when she said, look, we've got to be targeting something that answers to the needs of the system is right, but it always comes with this as package of properties. Okay, so here's a choice point. One could take that composite list to capture something like the intentional with an S content of the state of the frog's perceptual system, and then you could say that's a systematic way. It would be an ungainly, unusual content, but you could assign some form of content and solve this problem in that way. Or, and this is my preferred answer, one could resist the invitation to make any such ascription. So we don't make any intentional with an S ascription at all. I don't think anything is lost if we assume that the list picks out the state of affairs that the frog was targeting in extension that has all of those properties. But we have to emphasize that those things, of course, it's targeting because it's come to that, because that's what actually enables it to meet its needs. And that's why the system has the tendencies and responsiveness it has. We turn to Fodor's classic complaint. And he kicks back, as we know, and says, well, selectionist explanations in this sense are transparent and extensional. So he puts it in his usual jokey way. Darwin doesn't care how you describe the intentional object of frog snaps. Darwin cares about how many flies you eat, but not what description you eat them under. And he, I think, put his finger on something important in this response. He says, speaking of his own paper, what the paper was really about wasn't the tension between Darwinism and theories that are intentional with a T, but the tension between Darwinism and theories that are intentional with an S. if we come back to Ruth's work and we focus on something like the properties that are shared even by sentences and bee dances, and we ask, why would the bee dance qualify as exhibiting intentionality? She has this to say, because the dances display the characteristic trait of the intentional, namely they can be wrong or false. As she puts it, they have truth conditions. And this is something I want to question as we push ahead. A challenge has been made to this by saying, look, for all the from a cog-sci perspective, for all the purposes that we need for explain the capacity of the bees to respond, if we get the functioning isomorphism with the right correspondences between mind and world, there's no obvious reason why, from that explanatory perspective, we should treat that as having truth conditional content, even though we can accept structurally that something like this is the correct account of how the system is connected up to the world. So, as Ruscola puts it, the burden of proof lies with those who claim that functioning isomorphism suffices for truth conditions. Or here the challenge is, why should we choose to describe this in terms of something as grand as a notion as truth, even in these simple systems? What's going on here, I think, is partly the tendency to treat or demand that we have representational explanations functioning as mechanistic. People will push here for the idea that if there are such things as contentful representations, they have to pay their way by making a difference in the system, and the content makes a difference. Thus, representations figures exponentia in mechanistic explanations that answer how questions about cognitive capacities, not why questions in general. Or to, again, pick up on Nick Shea, what averting to content is expected to achieve, we might say, is to show how the system connects with its environment. Content descriptions help to explain how it interacts with that environment. Yet, of course, if we only rely on biosemantic or teleosemantics accounts for our theory of content, then there's something amiss with this to begin with. It will be best that we're only going to establish that, but we're not going to be able to show or explain how a system connects to an environment by focusing on the aspects that concern content is understood through a teleosemantic system, because it's not about understanding the mechanism itself, even though we can unpack that separately. So that I think is just a confusion, but it highlights the features, again, I think in this sort of account. So what makes the dances into representation is not what they do. So interrogating that isn't going to get us any closer to understanding their contentful properties, but why they work. So why they help cause the arrival at sites of nectar, hence the arrival at nectar in the hive, hence the well-fed larval bees. And they work by bearing a correspondence to what they represent. But here I want to question whether they have any kind of contentful representation by pushing the thought that we can have the notion of a correspondence without necessarily bringing in the idea of intentional with an S content as described earlier. Okay, so what would that mean? Well, let's agree that the best explanation of flexible navigation of honeybees depends on their capacity to exploit systematic structure preserving correspondence, which hold between their dances and targeted features of the environment. So that's the given. It seems possible to coherently doubt that mental representations possessing truth conditional content or intentional and truth conditional or other forms of of representational content understood under the guise that I described earlier play any part in these explanations. Presumably, defenders of RTM don't wish to rule out the possibility of deflationary contentless explanations on a priori conceptual grounds. So what that means is we should be able to run from the point of view of cog-sci, we could still explain the teleosemantic aspects of this, perhaps more teleofunctionally in some sense, without thinking there's very much by way of semantics in these accounts. So let's assume that the bee dances have the proper function of guiding bees to targets and that they can discharge this office successfully, and they can also lead bees astray in certain circumstances. The question hanging in the air is this: does it follow that such coordinated activity involves the creation and consumptions of icons which have truth conditional content? What actually could it mean to say that a bee dance is true or false? I mean, perhaps we can say that, but what is it to think that the bee dance in and of itself is true or false? If bee dances admittedly lack intentionality with an S, namely, if they don't represent things as being a certain way, as being thus and so, or to pick up the way it was put in the 2020 paper by Ruth, to say whether these are making claims on the world. Do we want to say that there's a claim-making aspect here, or can we do without that and still explain everything we need to explain? When Ruth came to Australia, it seems a long time ago in 2018, I posed that question. She pushed back to her own work to say that she was originally, in a more Peircean sense, still thinking not in terms of intentionality with an S, but in terms of intentionality with a T. But that only raises the question for me, again, why, if that is so, the common denominator for what makes something into a representation should be understood in terms of, say, something like claim making. So that's still what I want to move away from. So one way of looking at this, to quote a bit of Lewis Carroll, I think that once we let go of the idea that we necessarily can make sense of these kind of basic responses in terms of intentional with an S content, if that's right, then I think we have to let go of the idea of representational content at this level altogether. So that's the core of my claim. And I think it's something like this, working through whether it's even conceptually coherent to keep some part of this story, i.e. to talk about representational correctness conditions or truth conditions or something like that, if you've been convinced to let go of that first piece. So it's something akin to what happens here when the king and the executioner get into an argument over about beheading the Cheshire Cat. The executioner's argument was that you couldn't cut off a head unless there was a body to cut it off from, that he had never had to do such a thing before, and he wasn't going to begin at his time of life. The king's argument was that anything that had a head could be beheaded, and that you weren't to talk nonsense. So if we go back a longer way back, teleosemantics was meant to provide a flat-footed correspondence theory of truth. And here, Millikan's express purpose was to revive Wittgenstein's Tractatus picture theory in some modern guise. And those efforts were explicitly devoted to completing Sellers' project. Therefore, what we're looking at is there are maybe good motivations to look for something that enables us to see what's common between linguistic sentences and bee dances, because that answers a certain specific philosophical agenda, but it's one that's quite distinct from answering the explanatory needs of cognitive sciences. So when the cognitive scientists push back on this, they are saying that they can do the explanatory work without introducing notions of content of this robust kind. And I think that the philosophical agenda is an important one, and those considerations can drive us, but there are other ways that we could connect these, even if it turns out that there is a division between basic forms of cognition and what I would call non-basic ones that do involve content. Okay, so some implications. What if this argument was accepted? What I think you can still get is you still get a notion that's not as bleak as Rosenberg's eliminativist embrace of behaviorism. To quote the Rolling Stones, you can't always get what you want, but if you try sometimes, you might just find you get what you need. And what we would need is still an account of how basic forms of cognition that are more rooted in the purely biological could get us a grip and get us connected to the world in terms of something like a revised or weaker notion of intentionality with a T that isn't understood in terms of intentionality with an S. So a number of people have thought that there was something like this. I'm not the first to think this myself. Millikan's, here, quote, Millikan's technical apparatus does define a relation that can hold between a system's mental state and properties, sometimes instantiated in the environment, but the relation so defined is not has its content that. So we've heard this claim before. Others, I think, have argued that what we get out of these accounts is, quote, an important kind of natural involvement relation, but not representation or anything close to it. Or even Rupert, who is defending still a more representationalist notion, still weakened the notion, so the common denominator becomes some kind of privileged relation that isn't exactly committed to truth conditions in some robust or stronger sense. So a lot of the people who've moved in slightly more deflationary mode perhaps haven't ditched the standard representational correctness conditions line in every case, but in a number of cases, they think that what we get out of the teleosemantics legitimately is something less than that. I want to make that commitment more strongly. Here, I think, quote Shea one more time, what I think some confusion comes up about what content is and where it lies in these counts. So here he quotes, to quote him, he says, content is a useful shorthand for the object's properties and conditions that a representation refers to or is about. So that's almost if we take that verbatim, that's a statement that the content is the extensional properties that are picked out. But then he immediately switches back to describe what would be on the other side of that disquotation, to say, so the content of one of my thoughts about dinner is each person needs 150 grams of pasta. And so what you get on that is the description of the alleged intentional content that would be made true if the world were as it were specified, thus and so. And so there's equivocation in the discussion about whether the content is meant to be what's picked out extensionally or what is intentionally with an S described. I'm pushing for something in the territory that Jose Bermudez has raised before, that when we come to think about the properties of the world, we shouldn't think of them as contentful in and of themselves. As he puts it, and we can vary here for propositions content, propositions are very different from states of affairs. In particular, propositions are true or false, while states of affairs are not the sort of things that can be either true or false. On many standard ways of thinking about propositions and states of affairs are the things that make propositions true or false. If states and affairs extensionally targeted here aren't confused with contents of some extensional kind, and if intentional with an S properties are not the kind of things we find in basic cognition, the result, I think, is that we have a notion perhaps of intentionality of targeting specific situations or states of affairs without intentional with an S content. And that is the formula that will take us to the notion of something like a contentless form of cognition in the way that I have been pushing for it, but not one that leaves us without intentionality with a T. So what I want to avoid here is both a Fregean understanding of this kind of content, as well as even a Russellian, where somehow the world is somehow made of contents, or that we identify the contents with their correctness or truth conditions. Okay, one last comment. I'm almost done. If I managed to persuade you to come along with me this far, or to think that this would be a viable option, some authors will just kick in and say, well, that we could just subsume, for the sake of it, all that I've just said. Even if we admit it, we can generalize, further admit that there are a mix of properties, the intentional with a T and the intentional with an S, and just call the whole lot representations. You could operate with something like what Ramsey has called like a whatever policy. Call whatever is discovered to do the work in cognition, whatever properties it has, a mental representation, whatever its particular properties. Of course, yes, you could do that. I'm not really at all concerned about that discussion, to be honest. If that were the outcome and we agreed to make these more refined distinctions, and somebody were to convince me to call it a representation, I could, but this does seem to me a semantic choice at this point. I think that degrades the notion of mental representation from its original setting, but we'd have to at least just acknowledge that. It makes it a mere honorific. Label carries no particular explanatory value or scientific interest. What's important is that we keep the properties separate. So I think that's that would become a kind of what Rollins was describing as a not very interesting debate or discussion. After all, Shakespeare taught us what's in a name. If the important bit would be to track something like what Hugh Price was saying, we want to distinguish, as he puts it, representation subscript 1, keeping tracks of things using covariant or natural information, a kind of responsiveness and directedness towards the environment that only involves targeting systems in that way, versus representation subscript 2, contently describing the world in ways, intentional ways, that can be correct or incorrect, true or false, accurate or inaccurate, and so on. Price's advice that these two notions of representation do operate already in our thinking, but he says they should be properly kept apart, not clumsily pushed together. It takes some effort to see that the two notions of representation might float free of one another, but I think it's an effort worth making. Once the distinction between these two notions of representation is on the table, it's open for us to regard the two notions as having different applications for different theoretical purposes. So why push for this? Well, I think I want to stress, and this is the last thing I'll say, stress that, first of all, if you really believed what Price said, it would be not the best labeling system, if you really thought these were importantly different, to just distinguish them with a small subscript. It seems that whatever is common to being a representation isn't the fact that there's content, if that's admitted, but something else. So the common denominator feature that we were looking for would have to look at for something other than representation content. And if we come to that point, then I think we'd be better off in distinguishing these properties more firmly in the way that we label them. So that's the to keep them separate. But that's just a pragmatic point about how we might call these things different. The real issue is whether we recognize that these properties are importantly different, and that's largely what I've been trying to argue here today. We've taken that up in more detail in our most recent book in 2017 with Eric Meehan, and that's where I'll leave it for today. Thank you very much for listening.
Sure. Dan, you're happy taking the question yourself, right?
Sure. If you want to do it for me, yeah, it is late, but yes, sure. I like that. What a service.
Oh,
sure,
well, there's the sea of hands. It's really not easy here to.
Yes.
That me, Milliken? Did you say Milliken? Did you say Milliken?
Oh, I said there's Nathan Lutz.
Yes,
yeah,
I was just clapping.
Nathan,
So.
Oh, okay.
Thank you. Yeah.
Well, then, let's all clap. Yeah, Ruth then. Right.
All right, Dan. The last time we met, we ended up, I guess I had given a talk with somebody raising the question about intentionality with an S.
Yes.
And my kind of pushing on what that was and being rather puzzled.
Mm-hmm.
And so I came home and, some years maybe later, started to try to find out what the literature meant by intentionality with an S. And let me tell you that there is no solid answer.
Yeah.
Unless you really want to go back to Carnap and Frege, unless intentions are something like senses, or unless you want to do that, and I don't know why we'd want to do that. But if I look at the arguments about it, now the Fodor argument was very strange, because I mean the first thing that happened, as you probably know, is that both the evolutionary biologists and the philosophers of biology jumped in, and they were absolutely astonished that anybody could make such a simple mistake as Fodor had made in that talk, of not understanding what the difference was between being selected and being selected for.
Yeah.
And as a matter of fact, if you look carefully, even worse, I think, if you look carefully, suppose that Fodor were right, that there was no such thing as selection for, right? still what you would get would be not what he says. What you would get would be equivocation or ambiguity. It has nothing to do with intentionality with an S.
Right.
I mean, what his argument really, if it were right, which it's not, if what it would show would be that that there may be a problem about equivocation. To which, incidentally, I mean, I've tried to show a number of times why there isn't, but in fact, really, that if you look at both the producer and the consumer, by God, you get a pretty, accurate. But I've also argued that, look, I mean, what on earth do we want? Ordinary language is not exactly unequivocal. It's absolutely full of equivocation. So I don't think that something is somewhat equivocal has anything, has any problem whatsoever. So anyway, so my problem still is that I do not understand. I just sit here completely blank at this point. I have no idea what intentionality with an S is supposed to be. I'm not a Phrygian. If you want me to be a Phrygian, I suppose that's, then if you want me to believe in sense, that's, all right, I could, but I could just say, I'm sorry, I don't. What is this intentionality with an S that we're talking about?
Well, I think that, I think you're right, that it is, I think that the only notion that we have of it ourselves would be something out of Frege. I think that's right. I think you're entirely correct that that's the locus classicus for this idea, but it does shimmer. And the point is, and I'm not ascribing it to you at all. I think you're not committed to this. So please don't get me wrong. That's not my claim. So I think that what your account says pretty unequivocally, as usual in your writing, is this, that you steer clear of this notion, unlike Fodor, unlike Neander, unlike several people who explicitly endorsed it, but that you nonetheless hang on to the idea that even in the most basic responding, we have something like truth conditions. And I think I know even how it is that you think that.
But truth, the truth conditions is the intentionality with a T. Where did the S come from?
Well, no, I think, so I guess the difference between you and I, if I can sum it up, is that, if I try to sum it up, is I think you and I actually agree about this point about, the notion is tricky for intentionality with an S. It's not what I'm arguing for. If you have intentionality with a T, is it possible to have that without something that we could call truth conditions? I mean, I think that's what I'm collecting.
All right. So I mean that's all another problem. It has nothing to do with intentionality with an S, as far as I can make out. And but my question is, why not? I mean, why can't we say that the B dance was wrong? I mean, if it was.
Well, right. Okay, so I think that.
So I mean, what is this thing about the word true and false? Why can't we apply it equally to the B's? I mean, what's wrong with that?
That's right. So that's the substantive question that I want to raise, and I think that it doesn't do. I don't think it does the same work, and I think that there is additional motivation. So it wouldn't be just why not. It would be why should we? Also, there is a little bit of how could we? I think that if we have a totally extensional notion of truth, perhaps something like Tarski.
I know it's got this extensional as opposed to intentional.
Go ahead. So just to come back, but I say, so separate these things out. I mean, one is that the first part is interesting because I think if what you're right about, and I've thought this the whole way through, is that, and I think it did set people's teeth on edge, is they are in that notion of representing the world in a certain way, veering to something like, I believe, the intentional with an S notion. And we saw it in Karen, and we saw it in Fodor quite explicitly. But I think that's the general way of talking that I think is problematic. And I think your work.
But I mean, that's fine. So everybody uses the term intentional with an S. Including, as a matter of fact, looking at what Karen has done is really very strange. She seems to think that because a place can be represented one way in the mind of in the skull of an animal, and because I could say it a different way that there's intentionality. I mean, that's crazy.
I agree.
Has nothing to do with intentionality. It could have nothing to do with anything. I mean, of course, I could say it a different way.
Of course.
Nothing has been shown about intentionality and the actual creature.
So I completely agree with that. I think that's where you and I are completely agreed. The question was whether if we remove that properly from the equation, what's left? And I think also you and I are agreed about, I believe that's right, because I have taken a lot of inspiration from your work anyway. I believe we're agreed about intentionality with a T. I think that if that is the basis of the core of this, the only question is whether there are whether it follows, or either necessarily or there's other good reason that we should think that all, that's my question, actually put in the more precise form, is whether all cognition has the property of either having truth or accuracy or some other representational. And that's where I think that doesn't follow, even for explanatory purposes of understanding. That's not the best.
I'm not sure that anybody has ever claimed that all cognition is representational, have they?
Well, actually,
I mean, I think everybody's happy to say it's not up to the philosopher to decide, it's really not up to the philosopher to decide how much cognition.
That's right. No, there's a lot. I think there are a few candidate philosophers I can point to, having been in this debate for some time, who will say that. What I will also say is that cognitive scientists, as you say, tend not to do this. So when I look at the debate about representation, it typically is in the front end of Foundations of the Cognitive Sciences, books written by philosophers. Okay, so I agree. Yeah. That takes us back to Marx. That's what I wanted to kind of put some manners on that discussion, because it's true that if we just do what any cognitive science might or not call a representation, I think Marx's comment has some bite, because you're going to find lots of different, very different operational definitions at work in those kind of cases, and maybe things that wouldn't, as your paper points out, they won't actually qualify as, they're not the sort of things that, just raw correlations, for example, is a very common thing in some areas of the sciences, to call those representations just on the basis of kind of causal connections, which won't qualify. They won't meet the functional definition that you put in your 2020 paper, which I agree with. So I think that if we simply switch back to what do people call happen by whatever reason in the sciences to call these. So it's a tricky debate, I think, in some ways. I think that to get a certain grip of what's in the philosophical imagination, which as a philosopher is one of my concerns, I think what you said is absolutely on the money. I think that a lot of philosophers are wedded, whether they like it or not, whether they explicitly say it or not, to something like the Fregean notion. And I think that was there in look at Shay's comment that I finished on. He clearly has got that in his mind when he describes the situation. So a lot of the people that I'm discussing this with is usually actually philosophers, although I do talk to neuroscientists too. But I'm typically arguing with philosophers about that notion. And so I think if we clean it up, the really important question for me is the most basic, if we fix that, do the most basic, is there good reason to think that the most basic forms of cognition have to have anything like those kind of content? So I guess I will wind up on Hugh Price's side of things once I separate this out. And I think that we can, that there's good reason to make the distinction he made in the last slide. And I think that's good reason to separate the notion of the language out, just so that we're clear. So that's the simplest way of putting the argument.
Let me just throw in kind of an advertisement. And that is that my 217 book is precisely an explanation of why we don't need anything remotely resembling Fregean sensor Carnapian extension.
Well, that was your original.
So that's a whole different way of looking at.
You were signaling this back in 1984. You were signaling that back in 1984.
You're right. You're right that there's a lot in there that points the same direction. I was definitely slowly moving in that direction.
Yeah. But I actually think this is, from my point of view, I think this point, I still believe this is pivotal. I think this is really the important way to clarify the field. I think it would make a lot of difference if that point came through. I'll just say one last thing as an aside, is when you visited Australia, I think what you said, and I think it sent ripples through the room, but we had people like Paul Griffiths, Kim Strelny, Peter Godfrey Smith in the audience, and they were shocked to hear what you said about intentionality with an S. That wasn't a small point for people. So I think that's what I'm also going on. I think it matters because a lot of them have tacitly assumed that something like that has got, and as I said, you can see it in the Shea quote. I think a lot of people haven't worked through those points fully when we're having these discussions, and perhaps the implications. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Dan. Thanks very much for that.
Yeah, thank you. Really,
Yes.
thank you.
Thanks to the both of you. Eleni, please.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you very much for the wonderful talk. I have a question, and I apologize if you've already answered it in the beginning of your talk, but I have missed it.
Probably I haven't.
So my question is, you call the framework radical and active cognition or radical enactivism, and I was thinking whether you are radical enough in the sense that you confine your observations about representationalism to what you call basic minds. And when you go to higher order systems like language, for example, you seem to go back to representationalism and the traditional notions. And I would like to know why you think that, whether it is true or not that there are special uses or maybe frequent uses of language that have intentional with an S content. Why do you think that the whole activity of languaging, as we call it, is of the type that will have this kind of propositional intentional content?
That's a great question. I think that isn't clear from what I wrote here today, given the focus of this talk. And so let me. No, that was me. I will clarify this and go on record, but I think I am on record in several places. It's probably the way it's probably because this focus and making this one point is something I've been trying to do, for a long time, in a number of publications. But the truth is, I don't make the assumption that all language is rooted in content, contentful forms. Look, in the background, there's a lot of Wittgenstein in my thinking as well. And so as you rightly, the way that you put it was precisely correct. So you said, perhaps there are some typical, or we might even call it, I'm drawing on a phrase, I think this is a paraphrase of something from Wittgenstein, downtown uses. So the ones that philosophers tend to focus on. There are two positions out there. One is that there just is no such thing as content in language, right? That's what I call really radical position, right? That's a position that some people have actually defended. No content at all. I resist that because I do think, as you just said, there are some uses that involve truth. We can talk about truth conditional claims, etc. So I don't want to eliminate them from our account. And the alternative would be that we subsume everything to do with language within the one position, right? So we explain everything as contentless. So that's the only position I'm attempting to resist. So I don't want to eliminate talk of truth, even if we don't find truth at the basis. That's the claim. So just to clarify that, and I know that there's been recent work by Ezekiel de Powell on languages. I'm coming to grips with that. So there are many, many more people in what we broadly call an activist position that are very much down on the idea that there's anything to do with truth. So as you say, that if I could go back and revise it, it makes me look like a moderate enactivist rather than a radical enactivist. But we were radical at the time because at the time, everyone, we come back to what Ruth had asked, everyone, I think, in the field was more or less committed to the idea that where you find cognition, you also find content. So that seemed like a quite radical thing to say when we were putting it forward. And it's more to do with who I was talking to at the time. I think we were arguing with people like Alva Noe over perception and things like that. So I'm not making a strong claim that all language is contentful or that all language is rooted in anything like representational content, but I'm not denying the existence of representational content either, right? As some more radical enactivists do.
But would there be representational content of mental states or representational content? Okay, thank you.
Well, no, I mean, if you're asking me, yes, I don't think, so it gets complicated. I don't think that try and push you. I have some recent papers that might interest you. A recent book on imagination by Peter Langland, Hassan Smith. Peter Hassan Langland, sorry, it's beyond midnight for me. I'm starting to slip. He has a nice distinction between the kind of robust representational accounts of mental states, but he also points out that quite a lot of philosophers, are the ones that I'm aligned with, will be quite happy to say that, you know, you're in giving an account of my thoughts in linguistic terms, I'm also giving you an account of my, you know, broadly mental state, my beliefs, my desires, but that doesn't depend on there being mental representational content in my brain. So there's another issue here about what we call mental state content, right? So you don't have to believe in Fodorian mental representations to think that if I'm expressing the psychological mental content that I have, I'm also doing that in ways that can be true or false, right? So I can think things that are true or false. That's a mental state in some broad sense, but it can have truth conditional content. That's all I'm saying. And that's, I'm very much, yeah, in that respect, I still have some Davidsonian thinking in me, which thinks that some parts of language do have those properties, but they don't have it at the most basic forms. That's the really important claim that I hope is I'm trying to advance.
Thank you.
Okay, may I just follow quickly? I mean, I think it's continues with Eleni's concern, perhaps, because so the question is about the emergence of content, right? I mean, if you start with intentionality, without intentionality with an S, if you start with you know, I mean, yeah, extensional directness without content. But at some point, I mean, and that's a question whether your model actually is committed to content at some sufficient level of sophistication, right? And then the question is, how does it emerge, given that it seems, I mean, I suppose maybe you talk about it in other publications, but it seems that you talk here, the most promising account is you know, the teleosemantic account and so on, and that doesn't give you content. Well, then, what can substantiate this transition at whatever level it happens?
That's great. I mean, that's a great question. It's poignant. One of the secondary papers that I sent from 2015 that I did with Glenda Satney, which has gained a lot of attention too, is what we call the natural origins of content, because you're entirely right. If the simplest answer would be to go in response to Eleni's question, right? You just say, well, look, you want to save time, just get rid of the property altogether and say what makes it. And here's another way of approaching it. So one way, so interestingly, let me make it clear in response to Ruth. This is a really nice way of putting it. So when Ruth said, look, you can get your flat-footed correspondence theory of truth, you can get truth even at the most basic level, right? Even if you don't have intentionality with an S, right? So that's one way. And if you say, okay, well, that's going up and down the whole scale, right? That gives you something across all these responses. So if you can get that out of the biological, the teleosemantic, that's a way of unifying. You have something common across both bee dances and linguistic utterances, right? Yeah, of the kind that we were talking about. So you don't have a problem, right? Where I'm making problems for myself, if you want to put it that way, is by thinking, well, you don't really get the truth conditional stuff. So when I take the Pricean line at the end of the paper, that means you've got the bifurcation and you've got the situation that arises. You say, well, here's another way out of that. You just say, there's no such thing as truth anywhere, right? We just ditch that notion. And what becomes common then is that you have this responsiveness, intentionality with a T, but unlike Ruth's answer, there's no truth conditional content at all, right? Call it that rather than intentional with an S, in deference to what she'd said to me in her response. Okay, what happens then? I don't think that's an acceptable answer for our situation. So you're right, it creates, if I'm right about the limits of what you can get out of the teleosemantic natural selection stories, then I think we are obliged to say, if we believe there is such a thing as thoughts that can be true or false, like if we're not ditching that idea, then I think we're obliged to give an account of it. And that burden, I've tried to work up by saying, what happens if we, and this actually does connect with a lot of my work on theory of mind and other things. Like if we can start to reconceive what it is to have collective intentionality, if we can do that partly by using the tools of intentionality with the T to understand how we engage with others, then perhaps something can emerge in the intersubjective accounts that gives us at the basis, bringing in apparatus from culture, bringing in apparatus from using symbols, bringing in a whole larger story, which we haven't told in detail. I've gestured at this in the paper with Glenda Satney, and we did a bit more of it in the 2017 book, a little bit more, but not very much. And I'd say that is a project to be completed, but it's an obligation. If you think, if the arguments and the implications about where I was sitting are well reasoned, let's put it that way, then that's, and you don't wish to deny the existence of truth conditional content, then you're right. We're obliged to account for that in its natural origins. I think that's just the commitment of what I call a relaxed naturalist, not the person who just wipes them off the face of the earth like Rosenberg, right? So Rosenberg takes the bullet in a different way. He says, you can't get this sort of account, and then just removes this. I think that's not an acceptable outcome, because I do believe we can think for thoughts that are true or false. And I think this is something that we need to account for, perhaps by those apparatus. So the hope, you might call it slender, the hope that I'm living by is though, and that's set out more in that natural origins paper, is if we get rid of that confusion, then we have more tools and different set of tools that we haven't really applied to try to answer that question slightly differently than we've been doing up until now. The other one is just to walk in and solve the problem straight away by assuming that we can get it out of the biology in a very basic way. And I think that's not been too credible.
Okay, Ville is waiting a long time.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was really interesting. So my question is just sort of asking you to continue where you ended your talk and say a bit more about what these representations without content, what they are, or you call them this, you call the phenomenon intentionality in the article. And I guess it's not clear to me what it really boils down to. And this is, I take it that it's related to Itai's previous question, which was how do the contents evolve from these non-contentful, contentful representations? And I guess, so there's two ways, I think, to ask the question to help me and others maybe understand what it boils down to. One is, how do these representations without content differ from other relations that the organism that has them stands to the world? What makes them representations as opposed to just any ordinary causal relation that an organism stands to around it? And another question, another way to understand it, I guess, might be the same as what Itai was asking, is how can these things, these contents, these representations without contents serve to stand in justificatory relation to beliefs, for instance? And that's something I think you said in the article that they do, and I wonder how can that come about? So that's the question. What does it really mean to say that someone or something has a representation which does not have a content?
Right. I mean, there's a lot in that question that would take a bit to unpack. So you might have to remind me of some aspects if I don't get to it. Let's start with the main point. I think perhaps the best way to get at the idea is by subtraction, right? So one is, look, I'm okay if we want to call them representations without content with that special proviso about what the properties are. Like I said at the end, I usually don't. I just talk about, as you say, they're intentionally directed responses, right? So that target, but that picks out what we're talking about. And so one place I could just give you a more expansive look. I'd say one of the more interesting places where this is proved interesting and useful to other theorists, just to start there, would be, and in the 2017 book, we talk about it in debates about perception, imagination, and memory. it's really taken off in the memory discussions as a really useful posit to help us understand things. So just to start with the idea that I think it actually has traction elsewhere already in the philosophical space, at least. So people are used now using it in their advancing and understanding certain phenomena, memory, episodic memory in particular, certain forms of the imagination. People have called on it. So I don't think it's, just to start out, I don't think it's useless, right? So people have got some grip on it. What exactly is it? Well, it's sort of the thing shorn of the properties that we just talked about. It's what you get if you think, so one way of getting there really fast would be if you didn't think you could get, as Ruth described it, as, you know, kind of a notion that doesn't have any guts other than in Frege. So if you don't think it's going to get you intentionality with an S, if you think you needed to get that, that property, I think, is not on the table. If you think it also can't get you truth conditions, as per the previous discussion, then there's a whole lot of things that we know that you don't get. What exactly is left over then? We also talked about this in reference to Brentano. I think what usually happens, if you even go to things like the Stanford Encyclopedia, when people talk about aboutness, they immediately talk about content. And I showed you that again with meaning, and aboutness got confused, I think, in the Shea quote. And so one of the issues I have, even in having a normal discussion about this, is for a lot of philosophers, it's almost inconceivable what I'm talking about, because what would it be to talk about aboutness that doesn't have content, that doesn't imply it? And of course, even if we just talked about the extensional content, i.e. the properties of the things that are being picked out or responded to, if you were in Frege, for example, if you're thinking if you are channeling an inner Frege when you're hearing me talk, you're going to put an intentional with an S content in as soon as I describe the extensional property, right? You're just going to do that. And so when I suggest that we can talk about the things that are picked out just in extension with intentional with a T properties, as per Ruth, that seems very confusing to a lot of people, as a matter of fact. So, but if we can do that step, which I think is critically important, then I think what's left over is, yes, something that lacks those canonical properties that most people in cognitive science have kind of thought were the basis of cognition. It enables you also, I think, perhaps to, and that's where the connection with an activist comes in. It enables you to think of this response as less perhaps state-based, more dynamical, more whole system responding. So you think of the system as intentionally directed at aspects of the world, more interactively engaged with them. So it has a more pragmatic dimension of what the system does in response to these things. Where it comes in, how to explain the one of the points you asked is like, okay, so that's my attempt to give you a little bit more by way of characterization, and also how you might get a grip on what the claim is, which is to cut free of those properties and see what's left, right? But
no, I think I understand the claim. I'm just puzzled about what the content of intentionality or intentionality is.
Well, or intentionality is that notion of intentionality shorn of those particular properties. That's all it is. I mean, it's the idea that that's the most basic variety, but it doesn't come with that. Let me put it like this: it doesn't come with that standard package that you would find at the beginning of most philosophy.
I see. But what is left? What makes it representation as opposed to, say, just a concentration?
Ironically, I'm not arguing that it necessarily is representation. In fact, I'm on record of.
I see.
I typically don't call it a representation. What I was saying at the end, which is true, is I don't care much what we call it. Is if we figured out what properties it has, then the labeling is not that important to me, as long as we make the distinction between which properties are the most basic in the account and which are not. I do think you're right about that, but I don't recall putting it in quite the way you did. I don't think that these have the standard, when they don't have the standard set. I think questions about their justificatory relations, I think, are thrown into new, that's an example of something that opens up new questions, right? How do we, in epistemology, for example, I was thinking about writing a thing on an activist epistemology that would be related to this, but it opens up a whole lot of questions about, for example, what is the relation between basic forms of perceiving and beliefs, that perceptually based beliefs. I do have a discussion of this, which does change the dynamics. We had a discussion of this in the 2013 book around visual illusions, and I have a new paper that we're working on at the moment, which again returns to that. It's more a poke at the very popular now predictive processing accounts of visual illusions, but it gives this as an alternative, because I think those accounts run into special problems once you've tried to accommodate the fact that on the one hand your belief is absolutely certain, say about the Muller-Lyer lines. On the other hand, your perceptual states continue to seemingly contradict them in contentful terms. Turns out to be, as an example, an explanatory advantage, I believe, that if you think of this in interactionist non-representational terms, in terms of intentionality without content, you can talk about the fact that the visual system here is going to respond in a certain way that's not actually contradicting, but it is sending up responses that you can't resist seeing things in a certain way, but you're not claiming that the world is thus and so. But at the same time, your beliefs are unrevisable. So your beliefs are fixed. You know that the lines aren't the same, but you can't help but seeing them in a certain way. However, I do think there's empirical data that, by manipulating the environment or working in different environments, you can change that dynamic. So here's an example where I think, to take the point, is where it has some explanatory grist, where it's not just a philosophical maneuver. So it's certainly the case that a lot of the things I try to argue for are driven by these long-standing philosophical debates. But I do want to see how they, when you take them off and think differently about this phenomena elsewhere, how does that actually transform the theoretical framework that we're using in the sciences? And at least thinking about, it's not directly the empirical work, but reconceiving of those problems. And I do think that's the point. That's where people are finding to have real grist. Like I said, I could give some examples from episodic memory that are really interesting about things like memory traces. So it gives you a new way of thinking about these phenomena that I think that's where it gets its theoretical. It's not just a philosophical conceptual and an analysis. I think it points to something important in how we might reconceive a whole range of phenomena at that level.
Thank you.
Maybe let's try, please, to be a little quicker for the time we have left. Because there's lots of people still, several people. Robert Muski, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. Wait, let me put the hand down. So I wanted to ask kind of what Villa was asking about, because to me it seems that with just the proposal of intentionality without content that you are advancing, you're not really getting anything apart from pure dynamics approach. So essentially, like what happens is that you have selections in the past. I mean, this is more of a criticism of telesemantics more generally than of the etiological account of function than your particular. I mean, you're just assuming it's correct, right?
Yes.
So what it seems to me, and this reflects Marx's criticism, that past selections in evolutionary past just set up the organism to react in a particular way, but synchronically it does not really function with respect to those past selections, right? So there's no normativity in functioning, and therefore synchronically it's no different in its causal relations, in its operation, than a system that would be artificially designed by some engineer. So you said that you are open to discovering what the intentionality is, what those specific properties are, but it seems to me in principle problematic, because there isn't anything extra here that is offered by telesemantics, and therefore the talk distinguishing intentional processes from non-intentional processes seems more arbitrary, like at least of now, right? Like with what resources you're using. Yeah.
Okay, that's good. Yeah, no, you're right about the standard objection. I think, and here's a comment. I mean, not just if you go to Papineau or Millikan themselves in the broad camp, of course, that doesn't rule out, usually the case that people focus on, as I did there too, when we're talking about the debates about content, will be something like the case of the frog, very settled. We're talking about a history of interactions, right? But those history doesn't have to be in a long evolutionary past. We usually focus on that when we talked about getting the story about basic content, basic intentionality, off the ground. But of course, we're not locked into, no TLA semantics is necessarily locked into saying it's only natural selection of the long past that determines or fixes content. There can be individual learning, skills, development. In our 2017 book, Eric and I responded, Eric Rietveld and others have made this kind of comment about skilled intentionality. I'm not against this. I wouldn't call it skilled intentionality, because I think the idea is what's targeted builds around a whole set of responses. The account that we're giving of a whole system, stuff that we're working on now in a project here in Wollongong, is actually about skilled performance, right? So obviously, you know, an adaptive system is going to respond to its current circumstances. It's not just that, but what gets a grip as also the kinds of things that are the basis for your what you can see, what properties you can see, and how you build your responsiveness around them are two different things. So I've distinguished in that what gets you your basic targeting, and then how that connects up. And this is the more inactivist part, right? Because I've focused here in this discussion more on the debates about whether and what would motivate this idea of intentionality without content. But that's not anywhere near the whole story about what the radical inactivist position is offering, right? So that's just the more shocking claim that I have to usually defend. When we take the more positive position that relates to the previous question, we start mapping out what would it be. You can bring in, I think, these ideas about how the system adapts and how it adapts in its own responses over time. So it still focuses on a history, and some of my recent work on habits is still there about the idea that the habits that we develop, which have an intentional directedness, open you up to certain forms of both resistant, but also it has both resistance, but also a sense in which the habits themselves have a sort of openness, which many people have failed to grasp, right? So I think that you could combine this with an understanding of how habits through your history develop, but they get customized, right? So habits aren't as inflexible on the model and an activist way of thinking as others. So what I want to hold on to, let me be clear, is one of the things I thought was a little dangerous. If it's completely without any kind of locking function for a target, then you kind of, the system can move anywhere. And I think that's not the best way to unpack the notions of skills. We need to be able to think that the system has some grip on the world that is given its basic history, maybe its origins, its perceptual systems that put it in contact. And then those can be augmented in terms of the responsiveness that develops over time. So I think that if we can separate those two things, that there's still a possibility of acknowledging the points that you're making, that yes, absolutely, the systems get better and better at how they target what they're focusing on, right? And that happens over time. We can still bring that in. So it's not a dead, it's not as empty a story, I think, as that. And there is an activist side to it as well, that didn't really come out in the talk today, just because of the focus.
Thank you. Could I follow that up?
Yeah.
Just
Robert,
super quick one. So
okay.
yeah, like it seems to me that it doesn't really matter if it's evolutionary history or learning history, because all that all there is in this account is that certain selections happened in the past, and now the system is organized in a particular way. But this organization is purely causal, because the system organizationally right now doesn't have access to the past learning history. It's just, you might as well construct a thing from scratch by itself.
Oh, I see.
By yourself.
So
and
this
is an artifact.
Sorry. Yeah, so maybe I'm getting, it's late at night. No, this is the swamp man worry, a functionalist version of, like, we might as well, yeah, it's a very standard one, right? So sorry, I missed the point. So we could equally get, I mean, look, I think on a metaphysical level, if we want to say things like this, I think the fantasy of something like a swamp man thing that has no real origins has an origin in reality. If we take it out of the thought experimental, if it's not a lightning bolt, then all the systems that we build that have those properties are modeled and worked hard on by people who create systems, modeled on systems that actually engage effectively with the environment, as we both know, right? That's how robotics actually works. I don't think that's a terribly, I have on record not been a huge fan of the arguments for Swamp Man that push us into a purely functional account. I think that we do have an origin story that we do need to tell. I don't think it's the only story that we need to tell. I think that you're right, that we have to bring in how the histories shape the responses of the systems. Sure, we can imagine the idea that you could get really sophisticated things that have no origins, but I don't believe those are naturalistically credible, right? So I don't think that's, where have we seen anything like that in our environment apart from philosophical thought experiments, right? So this is the point I want to make. The developmental processes that we see in very sophisticated systems that are complicated have a sustained, hard-worked engagement with an environment, right? All I'm suggesting is that it's quite credible if you are wanting to situate cognition in the natural world to think, okay, this is a good account of where we could have got a grip, that we get those capacities coming up. And I don't think that, whereas I do think that the point about subtlety is about whether you want to allow what's being targeted to shift over time, right? That kind of thought, rather than having that fixed. I think that's a good point. I'm less worried about the idea that we could get sophisticated systems ab initio, just out of sort of lightning bolt cases. If that's the kind of the hidden worry behind the teleosemantic project, right? So why wouldn't we just have a purely causal story? For all the reasons, I think I'm very much attuned, as you can probably tell, to Ruth's answers on that kind of thing. I think that's just not a, it's confused to think that these don't have that they come into being just like that. That just can't be an account that we can give a credible story of as a counterpoint to that.
Thank you. I won't be pressing that. I think it's going to come up in other questions as well. So.
It probably will come up with Richard and Mark still here. Well, Richard, please.
Yeah.
Thank you. 2 comments. It seems to me, first of all, that when philosophers talk about this, they focus on truth purely as a predicate that you attach to some linguistically structured item, and they completely forget that in our language, they talk about true love, we talk about being true to your ideals, being true to your wife, being true to all sorts of things. The word truth has a vast array of meaning. Ones that are closer to what you've been talking about is if somebody is aiming to fire an arrow or shoot a gun, you say their aim is true if they've hit the target. You've talked a lot about target. You've not mentioned the word success.
Yes.
This comes to my main point. For something to be true, even as a proposition, it is to say something that hits its target. To take an example from somebody nearly 1,000 years ago, if I say it's day and midday, then what I've said has hit the target. It is day. If I say it at midnight, anywhere between the Arctic circles, it's false because it's missed its target. That's all that's involved really in all this stuff about intentionality with an S. As for the T, the intentionality with a T, that's what you get from towardness. Targeting is always toward. And that's why Mark is right to say all of this has to be embedded in the metaphysics of processes, because processes have direction. They're toward the future. All this talk is just so static.
Look, yes, I don't disagree with anything you've said, Richard. Actually, so far, I mean, you may think that we're at odds. I'll repeat.
No, I think success is what connects prices two different senses of representation.
Okay.
You ask what do they have in common? What they have in common is success.
Right. One thing that's missing from the talk, as is evident, is my connection to process and dynamics. I am actually committed to all of that, but it's not clear, because when we enter into this discussion, you're certainly right. When we're talking about this, it gets static. Literally, we talk about mental states. It's even in the quotes that I have. And I adopt that language without issue when I'm trying to focus, just for the sake of it, on the debate that we're having here about mental representational content, because I tend to try to channel the people I'm arguing with and not challenge everything all at once. But I'm on record of pushing in the direction of dynamic process-based accounts. That's why I'm attracted to an activist. That's why that's in the title. That doesn't come out in this talk at all, because I'm just trying to hold steady the question about intentionality. I'm thinking through while you're saying it, because I have, of course, in my earlier work discussed at length issues around success semantics. The issue is what sets the standard for success or otherwise. And there is a big debate in the inactivist literature around what, it seems like we're talking more about satisficing rather than satisfying at that level, right? So I don't know that, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger might be a model. So there could be lots of ways of engaging with the world that don't necessarily have a specified target. That's what comes out of the account that I'm giving. You can have a directionality without having a condition that's really specified about what makes things successful, even if you engage with the environment on that model. So I think that's where this loosens up between that and something like the more precise kind of picture that we get when we talk about truth in that sense. So come back to your original point about being true to something, right? You might say there's different ways of being true to a goal, many, many ways of being true to a goal, or being true to your wife, or, that language of truth in that sense, without thinking that there's just one specified way, right? But when we make claims that are more propositional, then of course we are doing something like I'm making a very specified claim. And that's what I get with the linguistic abilities that I'm talking about, which I think are quite different. So, I mean, maybe that's still the line that I'm pushing. So I didn't really find that to be I think I agree with, if I understand what you're suggesting, I think I more or less agree with that as part of the outcome of the account that I'm peddling.
Yeah, well, I wasn't putting it up so much as an objection, as a way of saying, it seems to me this was the missing element that you need.
Yes, no, I agree with that.
Positive content to the notion of intentionality with a T.
No, I think I agree with you. At least I took the spirit of the question to be very much the comment is very much in line with my way of unpacking. Come back to the previous question, like when you really start to unpack what's the difference. Yeah, I started by saying, well, you can begin by subtracting the standard way of thinking, but I think you're right. When you get down to it, this is what's comes out much more in the other works that I was talking about when we talk about the imagination. It gives you a different set of resources. It really gives you a quite different scope, which has proved useful for thinking about the phenomena of philosophy psychology more broadly. I think it gives us a much wider a canvas to work on. But I am very much committed to the idea that we shouldn't think, and I'm on record for that we shouldn't think of these in static terms and state-based terms all the way through. I think that doesn't help us understand the basis of cognition.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you. We have Ruth Kempson, Lucas, and Mark, and Dan. Hopefully, you're still capable of.
I'm fine. I'll just keep going, and I'll sleep through the faculty meetings because I do so anyway.
Okay, well, here comes my question. You'll hear from Lenny's and my talk when we give it that we're all very process. The whole thing is very process directed. But there's a simple thing, it seems to me, about the notion of content, is that the whole of philosophy and cognition has put the bar too high, because what Richard said is quite right. And when you look at natural language, the words that we learn and that a child learns to use, they're all much, much weaker. As long as you can get away with it, you don't know necessarily what your word means. You've just used it in the context in which it's been used before. And if it triggers the right affordances, nobody will even query it. Whereas if your notion of content, rather than saying it's something, it's take everything out that doesn't fit because you've got such a massive disjunction, it can't be that. It's rather that you want to have a probability-based notion. So then you can see if you have words being pointers or constraints towards a whole areas of usage, but you're not giving a disjunction of usage, just pointing to an area. And that's where I think distributional semantics has got something to offer, because these things are very weak. But in a context, they will in fact get narrowed down by the different kinds of overlaps the words give you. And then you can start explaining emergence easily. That's how a child learns, by having a context in which to put it and then knowing it can generalize it. That's how languages change. That's how languages arguably could have emerged, though for me, that's a rather too broad a question. But as soon as you think in terms of probabilities and shifting probabilities, context-dependent shifting probabilities, then the whole story about emergence looks very, very different.
Again, surprisingly, you might think, given, I'm going to repeat this, if we're to read my much larger over material, I'm going to be very sympathetic to this. I am embroiled for many years with just trying to make this one distinction clear. I guess this is what philosophers do, talk about slow thinking, right? And slow debating. So often I get bogged down. So there's two parts of it. And indeed, let me be clear. This is actually in quite a lot of the reviews. A lot of my work looks negative. So people they want to know what the positive package is.
It's all right, Nagarjuna.
Yeah, no, that's right. I think that's they're both part and parcel. The things that I'm attracted to, I think you're right about what you said, completely right. We want to have, and that's what my answer to Richard was about. There's softer, it's satisfying, not satisfying. And so this idea that you were not going to get anywhere with the idea of the precise outcome. So it's a really refined, but I don't want to deny. So here's going back to an earlier question. One thing I don't want to deny at the end game, in certain very specialized contexts, and I wrote about this in my 2006 or 2003 book on Wittgenstein. At the end, I was like, there are specialized contexts where we can, with great precision, state what we think, and we can talk in a way that we rightfully describe as getting this true or false. I don't want to let go of that notion, whereas many of my compatriots do, and they don't care to retain it. I want to explain what would you put it in terms of emergence, and that's fine. I want to know how we get into a situation where those capacities emerge. I want to know how, without denying them, how could we get in a position to think in those kinds of ways, even if it's rather specialized aspects of science or philosophy, from very humble beginnings where our engagement with the environment is much less, that don't start with those properties. And that's, if the really big debate in mental representation space has been something like, that's what I think. They more or less have taken those end states and put them in at the beginning and assume that somehow, we don't have nearly so much work as we might think we have to do to explain how we got to there. So that's another fundamental point. So I appreciate the comment.
Well, I have to say that having read your papers, I actually wrote on it. Hurrah!
Oh, great. There we are. That's not bad for 1 a.m. here. Actually, almost 2 a.m. There we go. Thank you.
Okay. Where is Lucas?
He's on screen.
Okay, yeah. So Dan, I've got a question about what you talk about intentionality without content, and you want to rule out Fregean senses as content, in a strong sense of a Fregean sense. But do you think, does this rule out all modes of presentation? So I'm thinking of someone like Rekinati's position, where you've got mental files that aren't thought of as kind of Fregean senses in a strong sense, but you can be tracking the same object, for example, through two distinct sensory modalities. Now, and if you're doing that for the system, there may be a question about whether it's the same thing. And so you do get the sort of Frege question. So I'm wondering, when you're talking about intentionality without content, are Frege cases possible? And if so, then it seems like you're really not very radical at all, because you are allowing for modes of presentation when it comes to intentionality without content. So I'm just wondering what you're going to say about where you've got different sensory modalities. Can you, and in your tracking, and I think Ruth's stuff, I thought she would allow for something like 2 different modes of presentation in this weak sense of a single object.
So yeah, good question. Really good question. Nice. You know, am I already a secret Fregean, basically, right? Even if only a weak version. Okay. I've come out against modes of presentation. With the 2008 book, I have this intentional attitudes versus propositional attitudes discussion. I don't want to deny the phenomena you're describing, of course, that track into the Frege cases. And I certainly think that when you have obviously names and language, that's where Frege gets those cases, right? That gives you the basis for that way of being confused about whether you're picking out the same thing. So that doesn't kill Frege cases. You just try to deflate the way that you explain them without introducing something like a mental content or a mental file, even as you describe it. So I think that's coherent. I don't think so. So there's 2 different aspects to it. Like, do I admit the phenomena, or do I buy into something as strong as, you know, the ideas of mental files? I think I can stop short of that. I do think, of course, that yeah, put it differently, and you might say it's the same thing. Tim Crane is closer to this. You might say, look, you know, phenomenologists who aren't necessarily committed to Frege per se are going to say things like, we can obviously as you use the example of different modalities, maybe I will visually encounter something that I don't recognize the same. So I think that, again, is a softer way of putting the point, that I don't want to deny that those things, the same thing, can present under different aspects, if you like, or have different phenomenal characters. I talk about phenomenal characters, but I distinguish those from contents very deliberately and strongly in a lot of the stuff I've written. So I don't want to say, so yeah, I'm resisting technically that reduces to intentionality with an S. Now, given the vagary, but to be fair, given the vagary of the notion of presenting in a certain way, right? That doesn't take us automatically to, and this may be more evident in this kind of case, it doesn't automatically take us to truth conditional contents and things like that, right? It needn't make a claim on how things are. That could be part of the phenomenality of how you react and respond to things, without thinking the system's making, you know, a Fregean style conceptual claim on things. And that, again, fits with that long literature on non-conceptual content and something in that vicinity.
But so you're denying that you're representing something as being in a certain way, but you allow for this intentionality to allow for something like representing something in certain ways.
Well, I said something, no, I put it like this. I do think this is a finer, no, I didn't say that. What I said was that there could be phenomenal characters. So take the visual illusion case as maybe a helpful grip. I don't want to deny that things can look a certain way to us, right? Without there being, and this is a subtlety, but it is true. I don't think that commits me to intentionality. The idea that there are representations that present the thing as being a certain way in the representational sense. And I think there's actually good reason. I have a response in some of the books to Michael Tye's work on this. There's a subtlety in that distinction that some people just push over. The fact that something looks in a certain way entails that somehow it's represented, and we've denied that explicitly. I think that's too fast. People want to run that together, and then they immediately run it together. And by the way, you're entirely right, then convert it into something like intentionality with an S. So they move from the weak to the strong in one fell swoop, right? And then they run to the commitment to really static, that we were just talking about in the previous, a bunch of static things like mental files that explain how that's possible. This is what I want to resist. So I think that, I'm not going to be persuaded from phenomena that we might talk about, like things can look a different way to us, to the idea that there's a certain way that things look to us, right? Those subtle moves in the grammar are important here. I think in terms of, and they do a lot of philosophical heavy lifting, even though they look quite subtle. So I can even send you the passage because I can recall where we make that distinction where I think Ty just equivocates. You know, there's like a little step in the argument where everything is done in just a kind of, as Wittgenstein said, the sleight of hand. You know, there's a little maneuver that no one notices, and then bingo, you're committed to a really heavy-duty metaphysics of mind, which doesn't follow from this. I mean, it's a good question. I mean, because you're right. I can't deny I don't want to deny certain phenomena that we have to explain. It's just how we choose to explain them. I want to be less committed to running straight into the standard intuitions that motivate strong representationalism. It's good to see you.
Yeah, and do send me that passage. I'd be really interested.
Yeah, I may be slow. As soon as I get a chance to think, I will grab it out. I know vaguely where it is. If I had the physical book, I could find it. It's harder to find things without the physical copies.
Mark, please.
Okay, well, thank you for the talk. I have pages of notes here, which would be too confusing and take too long to go through. So I'll try to be selective. A lot of these are just little comments, but at least one of them I want to focus on a little more deeply. Let's see. First of all, a sort of a macro architectural comment. A lot of the arguments that you seem to present seem to be arguments by elimination, where you say, well, it's not RTM and therefore intentionality. It's not CTM and therefore intentionality. It's, and so on and so on and so on. Interestingly, I usually agree with you about it's not this and it's not that and it's not that. And I've offered a lot of arguments of my own, but I disagree with the argument by elimination because you have not eliminated what I take to be the correct model.
Right.
And my claim would be that all of the negative arguments, the arguments against that you present, do not apply to the interactivist model. Incidentally, just a curious little point. You call the model radical inactivism. The term interactivism comes from a book in 1980 by Rita Vike, in which she coined the term for this model of radical interactivism.
All right, okay.
And I kind of dropped the word radical because at least at the time, it didn't have such positive connotations in the US.
I don't think it does anymore. I don't think it has good connotations now either.
But anyway, you know, radical was originally, the person who coined the term interactivism was Rita Vike. Okay. And it was originally radical interactivism, just a minor little point. Let's see. Okay, so argument by elimination, I have trouble with because I don't think you've eliminated all the relevant alternatives, and therefore it's not valid or sound to conclude intentionality. A little comment about some positions that you disagreed with as well, and I disagree with, and I just want to make an additional point about it. The fact that there is confusion in the literature about this strikes me as correct, but as you kind of point out, not relevant. I mean, there was confusion about phlogiston, you know, what is its mass, et cetera, et cetera. That doesn't mean there's no fire. There's confusion about meteorology. Is meteorology supposed to apply to meteors? Well, originally it did, but that doesn't mean there's no weather. I mean, just the semantic points just don't necessarily, they may, but they don't necessarily have anything to do with what these terms are used to refer to. Now, it may be that the referential uses are themselves wrong, but that's not the same point. So I agree with you about that. Regarding language, just a point, a claim point, not an argument. I think I'm much more radical than you are because I claim that language is not representational at all.
Right, okay, then you are.
Language is much closer to, and even this isn't quite correct, but it's much closer. Utterances are closer to operations on representations, or at least on organizations of representations among people's minds. But context dependency is absolutely universal. And context dependency means you can't have fixed content, and therefore you can't have fixed representation.
Right. Okay.
So, okay, so let me get to my more central point here. Let's see. There's several directions into this. I want to try to talk about content, what it is, a way in which my own work might be partially convergent with what you're talking about with their intentionality, but convergent in a sense that at least offers an actual model for it, rather than just saying that something like that must be there. But let me make a few preliminary comments. First of all, the Peirce discussion and the Frege discussion and so on and so on. I would argue that Frege is not the right model for this. He's not the right guy. Remember, Frege's sin is not a mental term.
I do. Yeah,
he explicitly rejects it. And minds supposedly can somehow mysteriously grasp sin, which he never even attempts to explain.
Yep, I agree.
So that's just not the right way to think about it. I think of content more in terms of Twardowski, who was a student of Brentano. And Twardowski knows that he doesn't know how it works, unlike Frege. But at least he points to sort of the functional requirements for something to count as content. And I take Twardowski to be closer to what's really going on here. He says, well, it's something like a picture, but he knows that a picture can't be a correct model too. So he acknowledges Twardowski. It's T-W-A-R, and I don't remember, and I think it may be an I on the end. Some ooze just, yeah, here we go, Twardowski in the chats. Okay, so I want to try to get to some distinctions here that I think may offer some potential solutions. It's a big mess, as you pointed out, a lot of different directions. One path into it is via formal logic. And I think the path via formal logic is not necessarily the best in some ways, but it is the best in terms of absolute clarity about what's going on. So the formal logic point I want to make has to do with the distinction between classical, foundationalist, abbreviatory, Aristotelian definition, Euclidean definition, where the terms are all grounded out in some foundation that is clear. So as with Euclid, supposedly, the axioms are in terms of points and lines and things like that, but points and lines and things like that are grounded out in terms of some sort of perceptual or some other sort of foundation. That has been the standard conception of representation, of definition, of all kinds of things for millennia. The contrast to that is implicit definition, which really didn't get introduced until the 19th century. And in my judgment, explicit definition in the Aristotelian sense, in the epistemological sense, doesn't exist at all. It's a classical correspondence notion. It's a foundationalist notion. There's all kinds of problems that have come up over the millennia that people have with it, but implicit definition seems to me to potentially resolve some of the problems. So what's implicit definition? Well, you know, there's an interesting history to it. One of the major start points is in the late 19th century, Hilbert published a book on geometry that was built around implicit definition in direct contrast to a Euclidean interpretation of axioms. And in fact, a lot of people argued explicitly against implicit definition. Russell didn't like it. A lot of other people didn't like it. But it is now a fundamental aspect of model theory. It is the foundation of model theory in formal logic and formal mathematics. It has certainly survived these people not liking it. So the basic idea is, suppose you take the axioms and instead of taking the terms in the axioms as being grounded in some sort of foundation, perceptual or otherwise, rationalists, who cares? But instead of being grounded in some sort of foundation, you take them as implicitly defining all of the possible models. And a model is an interpretation of those otherwise uninterpreted terms that keeps all the relations intact. So a classic issue and example of this is, suppose you have an axiom that says 2 points determine a line.
Mm-hmm.
So now you've got 2 x's determine a y. Well, one model of that is to interpret the x's as points and the y's as lines. But another interpretation, and therefore a different model, is to interpret the x's as lines and the y's as points, as long as you accept parallel lines meeting at infinity, because 2 lines will have an intersection and thereby determine a point. So this gives you a kind of an intuition of what implicit definitions are. How do you ever get truth if you've got an implicit definitional framework? How do you get truth in formal model theory? Because the axiom systems in formal model theory, which incidentally is the foundation for all of mathematics, you give implicit definitions of what constitutes a group. You give implicit definitions of what constitutes a field. And on and on and on. You give implicit definitions of what constitutes the integers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You do not give foundationally grounded explicit definitions of anything. But how do you get truth? Well, you don't get truth because the axiom systems are true. You get truth because you make claims like any model of this axiom system will also be a model of that axiom system, which could be true or could be false. You get truth out of indications.
Yes.
Now, those indications in formal logic will tend to claim to be necessary, no exceptions. But if you generalize the notion of implicit definition to kind of a dynamic implicit definition, and I'll come more to that in a moment, you can have such indications that are not necessary and don't claim to be necessary. So you can have any differentiation of this. Notice differentiation serves as an implicit definition of whatever it is that it differentiates, will give you that, which could be differentiated in this other way with this other dynamic implicit definition. And that could be true, it could be false, it could be true sometimes, it could be false another time. So you get truth out of indications. My own take on this then is to carry it all the way into a dynamic framework. You get truth out of indications of future potentialities. So you differentiate the world. There's no point in indicating future potentialities if you don't have a requisite sensitivity to your current environment. So you have to interact with the environment in order to differentiate this environment. And it might be that your differentiation is one of these environments in which flies usually are there. But that doesn't mean that your differentiation represents flies. The axiom system doesn't represent anything at all. It just simply differentiates A-type environments from B-type environments. The reason for doing it, the reason why it's useful to do that, is because these types of environments, not necessarily, but contingently, indicate the possibility for tongue flicking and eating. And they do so contingently. Maybe true a lot of the time, not true some of the time. It's not necessary like in mathematics, but that indication into the future is where the truth value comes from. So, I mean, there's a whole lot to be said about this. I mean, I've been writing about it for decades. Not to mention all of the literature on implicit definition and non-formal notions of implicit definition, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But just to stick with the frog for a moment, I would argue that frogs don't represent flies or BBs or dots or anything else. None of them, they may differentiate that category of things, but those differentiations are implicit, just like implicit definition. They're not explicit, and therefore there's no way to construe them in terms of intentionality with an S, and they're not even intentionality with a T, because they're not really about, they just differentiate. But where you do get the aboutness, and therefore where you do get the truth value, is the indications of the possibility of tongue flicking and eating. And there's no point in having the differentiation without the future orientations. So on the one hand, you've got something that's like cognition, if you want to call it that, in the sense of differentiation. that doesn't have content, that doesn't have truth value, and so on and so on and so on. On the other hand, you can't really have it. I mean, I suppose technically in a certain sense you could, but from a functional perspective, there's no point in having it unless you've got the anticipations into the future of what's possible. So there's a sense in which this model that I'm advocating might have some partial convergences with what you're talking about, but talks about them in quite a different way. I mean, the classical problem with representation going all the way back to the Greeks is, how do you account for truth value? And when I came up with this distinction, which is in my 1980 book, as a matter of fact, I wrote myself into a corner into the 1980 book, because I had this notion of differentiation. And then I suddenly realized as I was writing the book, differentiations don't give you truth value. So in the middle of writing the book, I had to figure out how I could get truth value. And it finally dawned on me, I can get truth value out of these indications that have to be future oriented. And it actually took a bit more than that, because that does not intrinsically automatically give you normativity, which also has to be accounted for somehow or another. But anyway, so it's a classic problem. Truth has always been the problem. And when I came up with a distinction, I explicitly faced what I took to be a semantic stipulative issue. I have split two properties that are normally taken to be equivalent when people talk about representation. I call one of them contact. That's the contact with the world, the differentiations of the world. The other one, content. That's the one that has truth value.
Right.
In standard ways of thinking about this, contact is supposed to be what gives you or what constitutes content. I mean, you know, a classic model is photos, but another classic model is the Greek. The Greek one of to represent is to point to. So, I mean, this has been around in Western thought, at least for 2.5 millennia or so. It's never worked because you can never account for the possibility of truth and falsity on that basis. My claim is, yeah, that's right. You can't, because it's based on a correspondence model. The correspondence model is correspondence into the past with whatever's reflecting the light or whatever else is going on. You cannot overcome Hume's argument, no norms from facts on that basis, but you can, and this is another subsidiary argument, you can overcome Hume's arguments if you've got anticipations into the future, and that's where you get truth value. So I would offer contact content as the fundamental distinction that is needed in a good number of these discussions.
I mean, I have to say there's a lot there, but what I took away from what you said, and certainly drawing that distinction in those terms, sounds very congenial to me, at least at first pass. I come back to this. Nowhere am I trying to defend Frege per se, right? So just want to be clear about that. That's not my game.
No, but my point was that even attacking Frege is problematic because he's got something that's just so wrong from the start.
Yes, but I suppose that one of the things I was suggesting, again, I take your points about the arguments of elimination. You're entirely correct about that, by the way. So I think that's true. I don't make more pretense about what we're getting out of this. Like, I'm not saying that we're eliminating all possibilities. In the book, I talk about opening up possibilities by means of these eliminations, but I'm not trying to argue that there's absolutely on record. I don't think that this is the only possible outcome. So I'm not trying to make that kind of move. What I do think is a couple of general points. So I found what you said quite interesting and congenial, at least as far as I grasped it, right? I'm not sure that if we have contact, I'm not sure whether you're claiming that that's still a form of representation or not, or implies it, but insofar as what you've described there, I think the notion that doesn't involve truth value is very much, as you can see, what I've been trying to push for as the basic form of the way we engage. So I find that congenial. I also, by the way, and it was a response to I think the previous question, do think that we have massive context dependency, and that indeed what you're describing as indications, or I call specifications or stipulations, are the way that we practically get a grip when we're talking in terms of truth. I'm very was very attracted to work by Davidson and Wittgenstein in this territory, and particularly when talking about Davidson, is the idea I don't expect us to have perfectly determinate contents, right? Which is a hangover of that Fregean position. So I'm also think that's quite congenial to my general way of thinking about how I do think it's possible to say true and false things, as I said, or to think true, but I don't think that means that we have absolutely determinate contents in at all. So that's not my position. So there's a lot there to unpack. Just to come back to the last point about the Frege, just want to clarify. What I'm suggesting is I think as a kind of diagnosis of the field, I think there's a lot of people working in this who've tapped into something like that Fregean ideal, both that it's determinate, that it's static, that this way of picturing the nature of, it's very clear, I think, in Fodor, this way of thinking about what a representation is has gripped a lot of the imagination. Now, you're right to say
for 2,500 years it has.
That's right. And I'm suggesting that, I'm doing my sort of Wittgensteinian bit of the battle against the bewitchment of intelligence here. That's the more modest way of understanding what my enterprise is. I do want to get at what and yours was right to say, look, we can also move to try to figure out what the actual, take the physician example. We want to get to the nuts and bolts, get a positive account that comes there too. I just think we'll go, because this is such a gripping problem, it's very difficult to disentangle it from our positive accounts. And that's what I'm very keen to make sure. That's probably why I stay more on the negative end of the street a lot of the time, to make sure that we don't bring into the wash too quickly some of the stuff that we've become accustomed to thinking about these problems in a certain way. So a large part of my work is, and it's been criticized a lot for this, it is fairly negative, right? In that respect. So, but I'm actually encouraged by what you said to find new material that I might be able to connect with that would give me some more of the positive material to unpack the position.
Okay, I've got lots of other responses, but we have other hands up. So.
Seems like Richard again. Is that right?
Richard, you're muted. You're muted.
I just want to make a small point about what Mark said. I buy his whole story about these future indications. That was implicit in what I said previously. Mm-hmm. The point I was trying to make is that when an action achieves its success, then what is pointed towards doesn't correspond with anything. It is what was initially pointed towards. If I say it's day, what I've said is the case. There's no correspondence between the content of my saying and the daylight outside. This is an identity theory of truth, if you like, embodied in a teleological, future-directed framework. That seems to me the only way of making sense of content and how it relates to truth.
Right.
That's just a clarification, but I thought Mark made one slight misstep in even talking about aboutness. Mm-hmm. The trouble is, with aboutness, you've always got a gap.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, whereas,
if the future indication comes good, there's no aboutness, there's no gap.
Right. I mean, I when we were looking at the Brentano material, I was trying to go back to the idea of directedness when I unpack the notion of intentionality, which may be closer to what you're describing in towardness. And then, of course, you're right. The question will be, if you eradicate, they take the steps. If you eradicate the notion of intentionality with an S being picking out and sense determining reference, right? sense in the Fregean, take that out of the equation, then you've just got the state of affairs that's picked out, right? And then if you wanted to talk about an identity theory of truth, if I guess the question for me is whether we want to talk about truth there. So in the basic cases. So I guess if we come to try to unpack what truth would be when we can talk reasonably about cases which involve statements or thoughts that are true, then I think that's the right way to go, right? We wind up with the extension, and you're right, that's a form of something closer to an identity. You know, it picks out the thing without having the corresponding representation of it. I see what you're saying. Yes, the question, I guess, was, again, for me, was in the most basic ways of differentiating and using Mark's terminology for a moment, of borrowing, making contact with certain things towards which we're directed at, right? I'd use a language of targeting, but it doesn't matter. You can translate it into this. Whether the question of truth can arise. To borrow for Frege for one moment, we can ask, and I suspect that the point I'm making about those cases is there the question of truth doesn't even arise in our basic engagements. That notion isn't yet in play in every instance in which we're engaging the world in the most rudimentary instances, right? So a lot of perceiving, imagining, etc., and so on, remembering, for me, the question of truth doesn't even come into it. And I think that opens up a way of understanding a range of psychological phenomena, but there are cases where it does. And then I think what you're describing has some attractive features.
But that's why I began by pointing out to the wide range of uses of the word true.
No, I quite like that.
It seems as if you're narrowing it down again. As
yes, I am.
Yourself said in reply to me.
Yes.
There are lots of ways in which I can be true to my ideals or to my wife.
Oh, yes.
Or whatever.
That's fair. That's a fair point. It's a fair point again. I suppose that what I'm suggesting is you're right in that my answer there was much more in the technical vein.
Yeah.
I think.
And I think that's where we go wrong.
Yeah, I get that, and I think. Well, I don't know what to make of it. I mean, I agree with the point, and I don't stand by what I said to you in the earlier comment, but I just don't know whether in every case, every form of contact, like I say, I don't know whether the expression being true to ourselves will apply in each one of those notions of making contact with the world. Even there, I might ask the question, even on the softer notion, whether the question of truth arises in each one of those cases, right? So I don't want to move quickly on. I endorse the point that there are more ways of using the talk of truth. I totally agree. I'm not sure that applies to all of the most basic cases, so I'm not sure I'm ready to commit to that claim, even though I do admit that there's more than one way of talking about this that might resonate with some of what I've been saying. So that's the best way I can be true to it at this time of the night. It's now 2:24 a.m. where I am, so I'm holding it together, I hope.
And for me too.
Yes. Where are you located?
I'm in Canberra.
Oh, great. Good to see. Yes, right. It's down the road. Good.
So Ita is gone. Adrian has one question.
Sure.
And that's the last one, I guess.
It's just a quick comment. Actually, so first I want to highly recommend Richard's book, The Concept of Truth. I think it would be a really good idea to read that.
Mm-hmm.
I'll make an audiobook version of it for you if that's.
Oh,
if
great.
Yeah,
No.
Really read that book.
Okay.
It's critical.
Okay.
My other comment is that I have these arguments. So I'm a student at the ecological psychology program at University of Connecticut. So I interact a lot with Michael Turvey and Claudia and all those, Claire and all these folks, right? And I have these endless arguments with them about the use of words. Because I get this idea that a lot of people have either a Platonic or a kind of naive realist understanding of the meaning of technical terms in science. And in my opinion, a technical term is defined by whatever theory it is that's using it. And the context of what it means is only within that theory. And I recognize that there's also a community of people who use the word, but it seems to me that yeah, I mean, that's just the point that I want to make, is that words do work when they're part of a theory, and these kind of context-free discussions about things like content or representation, it's kind of, I always am kind of like, okay, so what, right? Like, I know of a theory about content and representation that doesn't make the assumptions that are being argued against, and it's done a ton of work. So, you know, so who cares, right? But the other problem I have is that because everybody has fixated on what Mark calls the encodingist concept, or the encodingist theory of representation, ever since people were arguing against representation, like going all the way back to Gibson and before that, it keeps that version of representation in the narrative, in the dialogue, and it doesn't allow for the field to actually move away from it ever, because the anti-representationalists keep bringing it back. You know what I'm saying? Like they're saying, no, this is what representation is. We can't move away from that because that's what we're arguing against. And it's frustrating.
Well, I mean, I think there's a mix. I don't think that's, you know, I think some of it becomes part of the framing, like even the opening of my talk, right? So you go back and find the arguments from 30 years ago, and it's part of the framing of setting out what one, as you just described it, talk about arguments by elimination, what one is rejecting, just for clarity. So I think in philosophical theoretical discussions, that's the natural state of them. And also, I mean, to be fair, look, even if the tide is turned in terms of the fact that there are many aficionados who want to defend those positions, there are those who do, and they're not, and there's many who are making serious claims to try to continue to develop and advance them in new formats, right? So there's new movements all the time, and that's just how theoretical debates go, right? So there's adjustments of those positions. So
I don't think those theories in particular, right? You say, this person's saying this, here's what I think is wrong with it, as opposed to saying, actually, no, this is just what representation is.
Sure, but the positions I'm thinking, the ones I swiped along, like there's a whole new movement in deflationary accounts of representation. There's a lot of philosophical work that has to be done to decide what the merits of these individual arguments are. I guess what I was saying, and I thought it was encouraging in the discussion today, right? So there's for me, some background diagnosis of what's philosophically attractive. Why after, to make Marx, why after 2000 some odd years, we're still stuck having the debates in this format. There's something compelling and attractive about these positions that make it such that you can't just easily walk away, right, without engaging, if you're going to engage seriously with that. So I think that the point that I've been trying to get at, if I sum up a lot of the work that I've been doing, like I said, in response to Mark, there are those who've tried, and I do get this, and people say this a lot, you know, to try and get the more positive details out. And I think that's important. You know, what would be the alternative? Develop the alternative rather than just engage in the you might even call it a path of therapeutic work, right? Try and diagnose why are we still stuck with this way of thinking, and what's going on, what's making it compelling, and how can we do that? So I mean, a large part of my approach, although I do want to develop a more positive alternative and develop those pieces, is to kind of cut free the tendency, because I think if you don't do that, you just wind up with people coming back and reappropriating that stuff under the other framework, or attempting to do so anyway. And that's just what goes on.
Well, wait a second. So what did we learn from from behaviorism about reinforcement? So if all you do is punish or provide a negative, say, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, and there's never a path out of that, then how are you supposed to, I mean.
So I come back again. I didn't say that the only thing I do is that. I said that tends to be a big feature of what I do. So it tend to run those arguments, and I gestured at this, like the talk could have been different if I was coming here to give you the positive account I have of memory, which I didn't do, or imagination, right? So I tend to try to apply the notion, shorn of those assumptions to show that it does have good effect for transforming the way we think. There's an alternatives that we've overlooked. There's actually grip on, say, some phenomena like visual illusions, any of those things. So I think that absolutely, I don't want to say the only thing one does is negatively reinforce. I also think that there's a lot of latitude for getting the positive story wrong, right? Come back to the earlier point. Like, I'm not convinced that even if I get some take on it, it may well turn out to be the case that there's aspects of this that we're getting, you know, that are going to be missed. The model's not perfect. That's never been the case. Skeptical meta induction tells us that that's unlikely to be where we're going to land, right? So all I'm saying is that there's two parts of the project. So I'm not saying the only thing that can be done is negative. I think in a short talk, which it actually is, you know, it's to rehearse some of them, as I said, to clarify the target, give some motivations for why you'd want to go in this direction. Yeah, and for different audiences, this is harder. This is a particularly, you know, here's another context sensitive point. This particular group of people is, you know, may have more tendency to lean in a certain direction than we would if I went to a more standard philosophical cogsci discussion, where I have been before, where you really are on the fences just to get that conversation, just to get that possibility across the table. I think things have changed in the last 30 years in that respect, clearly. But I think, you know, it depends on who your audience is. So adjusting that too is part of the dialectical strategy that you have to take up. But yes, look, I mean, yes, I think there is some value in knowing what not to fall back into, right? And beginning a clear, you know, a clear thought of what's not going to work.
All right, Dan, well, thank you very much. You're our MVP for the reading group, staying up till 2:30. You're fighting for Richard in that position.
Oh yeah, well, two of us are going to be sorry in the morning, but all right, it's fine. Literally, I kid you not, it's a horrible thing called the Faculty Education Committee I have to sit on tomorrow, and I have to discuss something like some changes to the business, the Bachelor of International Studies that we have to teach into. I mean, I can't think of anything. I need a nano bite of attention. If I have just a little bit of attention, if they ask me any questions, I'm going to talk about truth in the broad sense, and I'm going to reference Richard. I'm just going to say, I'm just being true to my position by being here. I don't know if I've made any true comments. That'll be my move. Thank you for the chance to speak to everyone. It was great, and great to see Ruth, and great to hear your account, Mark. And so thank you very much for this opportunity.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.